as I look through the yearbook back in 79, 80, 81, and in my sister's 82 yearbook, I see how involved Mrs. Dorsett was in the early days of Capital Christian High School. She was involved in everything. You look at these pictures and you see her. She was the student council advisor, yearbook advisor, English teacher, literature teacher, girls counselor, and then she was at all the games. We had a rockathon once to raise money. All through the night, we rocked in rocking chairs. We brought in rocking chairs. People let us borrow rocking chairs so that we could rock all night long. And Mrs. Dorsett stayed there through the night, making sure everybody had what they needed, and she would put on music and change the records. And we played Grease over and over. Mrs. Dorsett loved music, and she played the piano for us at chapel. The first year of Capital Christian Schools was a disaster. Looking back, I'm thinking we might as well not even count that year. Well, Mrs. Dorsett wasn't there yet. Finally, the board hired Dr. Abernathy to come in and run the school, and he had the good sense to hire Mrs. Dorsett. And she mainly taught English, but she also took on so many roles. She was there as our advisor and helped us to write the very first constitution of the student government. She showed us how to put together a yearbook and to work with the Jostens Company to get our first yearbook published. She helped us establish a student store. Back in those days, we had nothing, and somehow or other we turned a utility closet or storage room into a student store. And Mrs. Dorsett and I would go to a place called AVA Supply and pick up, well, we would buy merchandise for the store, food and drinks and different things. And Mrs. Dorsett donated actually all this time. She wasn't paid anymore to take off in her pickup truck, and so she just became an important part of our lives as well as our teacher and our advisor at school. There was the deaf church, and Pastor Stan Dorsett was the pastor of the deaf church, and of course he knew sign language, and the deaf people loved him, but they also loved Mrs. Dorsett even though she couldn't sign. And I remember seeing her there communicating with some of the deaf people. They loved her. She played the piano in the deaf church. I know that sounds kind of funny because she was a really good piano player. For a while I was leading the deaf choir, and Mrs. Dorsett played the piano accompanying the deaf choir. Those are great memories. Those were great times. I don't know if it was so she could keep an eye on her children all the time, but her home was always open. And so Margie and Cindy and Dave would have all their friends over, and the house was always full of kids. And that was great. Mrs. Dorsett would just make sure we had everything we need. Mrs. Dorsett loved a good pun. She wouldn't admit that. If somebody came up with a play on words, she would act like it was the worst thing she'd heard all day, and sometimes even leave the room. But, you know, she loved it. I think the Dorsett children were really good at coming up with a whole string of really awful puns. I think Miss Dorsett was proud of them because they were good with words. they were clever, and they got that from her. I have a memory of a long time ago when Mrs. Dorsett said to me, "I'll teach you to play the piano if you, in exchange, teach me sign language." I said, "Good idea." So every week, I would go to Mrs. Dorsett's house for my piano lesson. Then we would change, and I would teach Mrs. Dorsett sign language. And I'd say, "You need to learn sign language ASL, because deaf people communicate in ASL." Mrs. Dorsett had a hard time with ASL because she wanted to learn to sign in exact English. She would say, "Hi, how are you?" And I'd say, No. You need to learn ASL. Deaf people communicate in ASL." And say, "Hi, how you doing?" But Mrs. Dorsett said, "No, that's not good. Deaf people need to learn English." And I'd say, "Yes, deaf people learn English in school and in writing papers, but sign language, communicating with friends in groups, they sign in ASL." So we didn't continue with the lessons for a long time because Mrs. Dorsett found it hard to learn ASL. And me, well, my piano playing, it was awful. It wasn't a good idea. I never saw a moor, I never saw the sea, yet know I how a hither looks, and what a wave must be. I never spoke with God, nor visited in heaven, yet sure am I of the spot, as if the chart were given. That's a poem by Emily Dickinson. And sometimes I find myself quoting such poems, and I go, wow, why do I know that? Oh yes, because Mrs. Dorsett was my English teacher. And she gave so much of herself that her students throughout the years will remember her and remember what she taught us. The last time I saw Mrs. Dorsett must have been about 12 years ago now. I was traveling with my family down in California, and we wanted to stop by and see Mrs. Dorsett. And we had a great reunion, and my family got to meet her. And out of all the places I've been, all the things that I've done, all of my accomplishments, I think probably the thing that meant the most to me was when Mrs. Dorsett looked at me and looked at my family and said, "You've done well." Because she was the kind of teacher that had such a rapport with her students that you didn't just want to do well in her class to get a good grade, but you wanted to do well because you didn't want to let her down. And that's the kind of teacher she was. And I've become a school teacher myself, and a lot of times I find myself remembering Mrs. Dorsett and perhaps trying to emulate her in the classroom, because she was a very effective teacher. She was a good teacher, a good friend, and I'll never forget her. And I think today, during this celebration that I wish I could be at, I think a lot of people feel the same way. And I know this, on this special day, because of whom Mrs. Dorsett was, her children are rising up and calling her blessed.